Christmas is the season of peace, but in this town, it's also the season of revenge. Christmas in Elden Grove had always been a time of warmth and cheer, the kind of holiday magic that seemed to seep into every corner of the village. Nestled in the northern woods, this small town was like something out of a forgotten time. The scent of pine trees and fresh snow hung in the air, and the crisp winter winds whispered through the narrow streets. Every year, the town transformed into a wonderland of sparkling lights, festive wreaths, and the sweet aroma of gingerbread and cinnamon drifting from every hearth. People exchanged small gifts, gathered together to share hearty meals, and celebrated by the glow of roaring fires. The town's traditions were cherished, and each year brought the familiar comforts of the season. But beneath the warm embrace of the holidays, Elden Grove carried an unsettling shadow, one that hovered just beyond the glow of the Christmas lights. A dark tale, a legend as old as the town itself, cast its long shadow over every Christmas celebration. It was a story that the town's elders rarely spoke of, and when they did, it was only in hushed tones, as if afraid that the very mention of it would bring it to life again. Elden Grove's Christmas was forever marked by a curse, one that had been unleashed by a tragedy that occurred more than 50 years ago. The tale was a chilling one, passed down through generations, and while some dismissed it as superstition, the fear remained. The curse had its roots in the story of Harold Stanton, a once respected and beloved man who had been the proud father of a young family. But in an act of unimaginable violence, Harold had brought ruin to his own household and the town. It was Christmas Eve, years ago, when Harold, in a fit of grief and fury, slaughtered his wife and children after desecrating a sacred family graveyard that lay hidden deep in the surrounding woods. The graveyard, long considered forbidden, was said to hold the resting places of ancient ancestors, guardians of an unearthly force that demanded respect. Harold's actions had awakened this malevolent spirit, and in return, the darkness had consumed him. That night, when Harold returned home, he was no longer the same man. His once loving demeanor had been replaced by a cold, violent rage, and in his madness, he killed his family, leaving their bodies in a gruesome scene that would forever stain the Stanton name. The following morning, the town awoke to the horrors of the massacre. Harold had disappeared into the wilderness, his body never found. Some believed he had been taken by the very forces he had disturbed, but others whispered that he was still out there, bound to the curse, waiting for the right moment to return. The townspeople could never forget that night, and every Christmas since had been haunted by the memory of the tragedy. The curse, they said, lingered over the village like a heavy fog, and each year, it grew stronger, as if waiting for the right time to claim its next victim. This year, however, the curse was no longer just a distant legend. Something had shifted, and the fear that had once been a quiet undercurrent now bubbled to the surface. It all started with the arrival of a single, tattered Christmas card, which appeared on the doorstep of the town's mayor, Mrs. Lila Harper, just a week before Christmas. The card was nothing like the cheery, colorful cards that flooded the mailboxes of Elden Grove every year. This one was old, its edges yellowed with age, the ink smudged, and the words, scrawled in a jagged hand, sent a chill down Lila's spine. This year, they return. At first, the card was dismissed. It was easy to assume it was some strange prank, a joke played by an outsider who didn't know the town's history. But as the card passed from hand to hand, the atmosphere in Elden Grove began to shift. Whispers began to spread, and it became clear that the town wasn't just remembering the curse this year. They were afraid. The rumors that had always swirled about the curse suddenly became very real. Strange events began to occur. Late at night, windows shattered with no cause, and doors were found wide open as if someone, or something, had been tampering with them. The unsettling sounds, too, returned. The deep, almost mechanical groaning of the wind, followed by eerie whispers that no one could trace. People began to speak of visions, of waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, only to find themselves staring at the foot of their beds where a shadowy figure would stand, its hollow eyes fixed on them. The worst, however, was the dreams. Almost every resident of Elden Grove began experiencing vivid, terrifying nightmares. They would dream of Harold Stanton, not as a man, but as a ghost, pale and twisted, wandering through the snowy graveyard where he had desecrated the graves so many years ago. His hollow eyes burned with an unearthly fire, and in these dreams he would beckon them toward him, his voice barely a whisper. The curse returns. You cannot escape it. By the time the town had grown too fearful to sleep, one thing was certain. The curse of Harold Stanton was not only real, it was back, and this time, it would not be denied. Elden Grove had once known Harold Stanton as a good man, a quiet and reliable father, a husband who would never dream of doing harm to his family. His marriage to Martha had been one built on love, and together they had 3 children, a son, Caleb, and 2 daughters, Evelyn and Sarah. The Stanton family home was a place of joy, a warm refuge from the cold winter months. Their Christmases were always full of laughter, and the town often looked to them as the example of what a perfect family should be. But that all changed one fateful night, the night that would forever alter Elden Grove's history. Harold had always been a man of curiosity, one who wasn't afraid to challenge the old stories that the townsfolk clung to. One night, while out drinking with friends, Harold had heard the tale of the ancient cemetery, the forbidden burial ground deep in the woods that no one dared visit. It was said that the cemetery was cursed, that the spirits of Elden Grove's first settlers still lingered there, bound to the earth by an unknown force. But Harold, drunk on bravado, dismissed the story as mere superstition. He and his friends decided to trespass there that very night. The graveyard was not just old, it was ancient. The tombstones were worn and covered with thick, creeping moss, their engravings nearly illegible. The air around it was thick, oppressive, and the trees seemed to bend toward the cemetery as if they were watching. The graves were said to be the final resting places of the village's earliest settlers, those who had founded Elden Grove. But Harold, in his arrogance, saw nothing but an opportunity to prove his own superiority, to challenge what others feared. As he stepped onto the cemetery grounds, something stirred beneath the earth. The ground trembled briefly, a low, almost imperceptible hum filling the air. But Harold paid it no mind. His friends dared him to desecrate the graves, to prove his defiance. And so, in the dead of night, Harold dug up the bones of an ancient ancestor, scattering them across the frozen earth. That was the moment the curse was unleashed. When Harold returned home that night, his demeanor was unrecognizable. His once lovable nature had been replaced by a deep, violent rage. He no longer saw the world in the same way. The old warmth had left him, and in its place was something darker, something primal. The next morning, the town awoke to find Harold's house covered in blood. Martha and the children had been slaughtered, their bodies twisted and discarded in grotesque positions, as if Harold had been possessed. The town had never seen anything like it, and when they searched for Harold, they found no trace of him, just the echo of his scream in the woods, fading away. Harold Stanton's fate remained unknown. Some believed he had vanished into the wilderness, lost forever, while others believed he had been claimed by the very spirits he had disturbed, bound to wander for eternity. Either way, the curse lingered, and with it, the fear. The appearance of the card was only the beginning. It arrived quietly in the mailbox, slipping under the radar at first, like an ordinary Christmas card. But soon, other strange occurrences followed that could not be ignored. At first, it was just one person, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, who claimed to have seen strange lights flickering over the cemetery late one evening. The lights were erratic, too bright and too low to be stars, and they hovered unnaturally over the graveyard. His reports were dismissed as a misinterpretation of the Christmas lights on nearby houses. But as the days passed, more sightings were reported. These lights no longer flickered, but hovered in strange, geometric patterns, their glow casting eerie shadows that danced across the graves. People started claiming to see shadowy figures walking along the streets at night, figures that seemed to vanish into thin air before anyone could approach. No one could explain it, and no one dared speak of it aloud, but the unease in the air grew stronger with each passing day. In the small, isolated town of Elden Grove, these occurrences sparked something ancient, something buried deep in the town's history. Nick, Sarah, Jeremy, and Alice, for teenagers who had grown up hearing about the legends of the town, had always thought the stories about Elden Grove's dark past were just that, stories. They'd heard about the curse from their parents, teachers, and elders, who would tell tales of the horrific events surrounding the Stanton family. But to them, it was always just a cautionary tale designed to keep kids from misbehaving. This Christmas, however, something felt different. The air was thicker, charged with a tension that the teens couldn't explain. The unsettling occurrences were no longer isolated incidents, but seemed to be gathering force, drawing everyone's attention toward the cursed history of Elden Grove. Curiosity eventually got the better of them. The teens decided to investigate. Their journey began innocently enough, digging through old newspapers at the local library. They weren't expecting much, just a few more mentions of Harold Stanton and the tragedy that had occurred so many years ago. And that's exactly what they found. Articles printed in great detail about the horrific event. Harold Stanton, driven mad by grief, had slaughtered his entire family on Christmas Eve, leaving nothing but blood and broken bodies. The town had never quite recovered from the event, and the whispers about a curse began almost immediately. But then, in a dusty corner of the library, something caught their eye. Hidden beneath the piles of yellowed newspapers was an old clipping with the chilling headline, "Family Slaughtered on Christmas Eve by Father." Beneath the headline, a small, handwritten note in the margin caught their attention. "The curse is eternal. It will return when the time is right." The note sent a cold shiver down their spines. It didn't seem to fit with the rest of the article, and it wasn't something they had seen in any of the other clippings. At first, the teens tried to laugh it off. It was just some old person's cryptic message. They reasoned that it didn't mean anything, that it was just a line written by someone who believed too strongly in the town's superstitions. But as they read further, the more they realized that the curse wasn't just a story, it was a living part of Elden Grove's history. Their laughter turned to unease, and the weight of the town's dark past seemed to close in around them. The final piece of the puzzle came when they discovered the legend of the cemetery, the place where Harold Stanton's body was supposedly buried. The old graveyard, which had long been abandoned, was said to be the heart of the curse. It was here that the events surrounding the Stanton family's tragic end had unfolded, and it was here that the curse had supposedly begun. On Christmas Eve, determined to uncover the truth, they made their way to the cemetery. Armed with flashlights, they ventured into the woods surrounding the town, the cold air biting at their skin. The crunch of snow beneath their boots was the only sound that accompanied them as they walked, and the dense trees formed a tight tunnel of white, the branches heavy with snow. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape as if the world itself were holding its breath. As they reached the cemetery, a thick tension filled the air. The gravestones loomed over them, twisted and gnarled, like the fingers of some ancient being reaching from the earth. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a mournful sound, as if the very spirits of the dead were trying to warn them to turn back. But the teens pressed on, curiosity driving them forward despite the growing sense of dread. Standing in the center of the graveyard, they were unsure of what they were expecting. But then they saw it, the Christmas card, lying on one of the gravestones. The ink was fresh, the words still legible. "The curse will claim its due. Welcome back, Harold." The message sent a wave of dread crashing over them. This wasn't some prank. It was a direct challenge to whatever dark force haunted Elden Grove. As they read the card, they felt it. The temperature dropped, and a low tremor in the earth beneath them made their feet feel unsteady. A shadow flickered in the distance, moving between the gravestones like a wisp of smoke. The wind picked up, howling in their ears, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The air was thick with an energy they couldn't describe. Suddenly, the figure appeared. Tall, cloaked in shadows, its face hidden beneath a hood. It was Harold's ghost, or something that looked like him. His eyes were empty, hollow sockets, and his face was a twisted mask of agony. His hands, skeletal and clawed, reached toward them. His voice was low and guttural, echoing with the pain of centuries, as he whispered their names one by one. Fear surged through the teens. They turned and ran, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the snow, their hearts pounding in their chests. The graveyard seemed to stretch on forever, the trees twisting into strange shapes as they ran through the darkness. The path they had walked just moments before now seemed alien, a maze of shadows that closed in on them. They barely made it back to the town. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, and their bodies shook with adrenaline as they locked themselves inside their homes. But the terror didn't stop. The days that followed were filled with more strange happenings, voices calling their names in the dark, whispers on the wind, and footsteps echoing behind them when no one was there. The town's lights began to flicker, and a sense of dread spread like a disease. Then came the cards, each one bearing a different cryptic message. Not everyone will see Christmas morning. A debt must be paid. The curse is unbroken. Fear gripped the hearts of every villager. Christmas was no longer a time of joy. It had become a time of terror. Families locked their doors, shut their windows tight, and refused to speak of the curse. But the darkness continued to grow stronger, its grip tightening with every passing day. As the clock struck midnight on Christmas Eve, the worst fears of the townspeople were realized. Harold Stanton's ghost appeared once again, this time in the town square. His form was solid and terrifying, his presence overwhelming. He was not just a ghost, but something far more sinister, an entity bound to the land, to the curse he had brought upon it. The people of Elden Grove knew what had to be done. The curse could only be broken by confronting the source, the Stantons. It was Jeremy, a descendant of the family, who stepped forward, knowing that his bloodline was the key to ending the nightmare. With trembling hands, Jeremy recited the ancient incantation passed down through his ancestors. The air grew colder still, and a scream of agony echoed through the town as Harold's ghost writhed in pain. The people held their breath, watching in stunned silence. Then, just as the clock struck 1, Harold's presence began to fade. The wind died down, and the earth stopped trembling. The curse was broken. Elden Grove was free. But the memory of that Christmas, the terror that had haunted the town, would live on forever. If you enjoyed this chilling story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more spine-tingling tales, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a moment of the horror.